I never thought betrayal would come in whispers, in little details I ignored, in moments that felt insignificant at the time. But that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It moves silently, creeping into your life until one day you look around and realize you're drowning in it. It all started when I came back home after years of studying abroad. The city had changed, but not as much as I had. I had left as an ambitious student, eager to prove myself, and returned as a man with a degree, confidence, and a clear direction. The first few weeks were a blur of reunions, catching up with old friends, and settling back into a place that no longer felt entirely mine. And then there was her. I met Elena in the most unexpected way. It was late evening, and I was walking home after a meeting with an old friend when I heard shouting in a side alley. A girl was cornered by two guys, their voices low and taunting, their laughter sharp. I didn't think, I just reacted. The fight was brief. One good punch and few threats sent them running. She was shaken but composed, a quiet strength in her posture. "Are you okay?" I asked, watching as she straightened her coat. She nodded, brushing strands of dark hair from her face. "I had it under control." I laughed. "Sure you did." That made her smile, just a small, amused curve of her lips. "I owe you one. Come to my place. I'll make you tea and the best pie you've ever had." I almost declined, but something in her eyes made me hesitate. There was a spark, a challenge, and I liked it. That night, over tea and homemade apple pie, we talked for hours. She was a swimming instructor, passionate about her job, and had this magnetic confidence that pulled me in. One evening turned into weeks of seeing each other, then months, then a year. We got married in a quiet ceremony, just close friends and family. Marriage, I had thought, would be a steady road. Sure, there'd be adjustments, compromises, but nothing we couldn't handle. And for a while, that was true. The first year was good. We laughed a lot. We fought over little things, like how she never put the cap back on the toothpaste or how I left my coffee cups everywhere, but those were the kind of fights that ended in kisses, not silence. I took on more clients, designing high-end homes for the wealthy, and my reputation grew. Elena loved her job at the pool, and we both had our own worlds, our own routines. Then came the first red flag. One evening, she came home looking shaken. She told me that a guy at the pool had been inappropriate with her, too aggressive, too pushy. "I told him off," she said, her hands gripping a mug of tea, "but he wouldn't back down. The police took him away." I was furious. "Do you want me to talk to someone? Make sure he stays the hell away from you?" She shook her head. "It's over now. Just hold me." So I did. I held her, whispering reassurances, believing that was the end of it. But then, at one of our house parties, something happened that I couldn't shake. My longtime friend Mark had been drinking, but he wasn't the type to lose control. At some point, Elena pulled me aside, tears in her eyes. "He tried to touch me," she said, her voice breaking. I saw red. I confronted Mark immediately, pushing him against the wall. "What the hell did you do?" He looked stunned. "I didn't touch her." "She's crying, Mark." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I swear to you, I didn't do anything. You're my friend. I'd never—" "Get the hell out of my house." Mark stared at me for a long moment before grabbing his coat, but before he left, he turned back. His voice was low, almost pitying. "When your eyes finally open," he said, "you're going to regret a lot of things." I should have asked what he meant. I should have listened. But at the time, I was too angry, too protective of my wife. Life moved on. My business flourished. Clients with deep pockets kept coming, and soon money was no longer a concern. To celebrate, I surprised Elena with a new car. "You work so hard," I told her, pressing the keys into her palm. "You deserve it." She was thrilled, and then she made a decision that, at the time, seemed harmless. "I think I'm going to quit the pool," she said one evening. "I want to do something more fulfilling. Public work, helping people, making a difference." "Sounds great," I said, because why wouldn't it be? If she was happy, I was happy. But things changed. Her public work consumed her. There were endless meetings, interviews, late-night events. At first I was proud. My wife was making an impact. But then I started noticing things. She was restless, distracted. At first, I thought it was the pressure of her new work, constantly meeting new people, managing projects, being in the public eye. But there was something else, something deeper. A tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. A shift in her moods, swinging between excitement and exhaustion. Some nights, she'd come home buzzing with energy, talking a mile a minute about some new initiative, some big idea. Other nights, she'd be withdrawn, barely touching her food, staring off into space. When I asked if she was okay, she'd force a smile and say, "Just a lot on my mind." Then came the scandal. She came home one day, pale and furious. "Some asshole is accusing me of harassment," she spat. "Can you believe that?" Wait, what? Who? Some guy I barely spoke to. It's a lie, obviously. The next morning, the story vanished. The man who accused her, he was institutionalized. It should have bothered me. It should have made me question things. But I didn't. Then the messages started. The first one was simple. "Be careful. She'll come for you next." I deleted it. Spam, I told myself. A prank. 1. Night. She came home drunk. More than that. Aggressive. The moment I walked through the door, she was on me, kissing me, pulling at my clothes. But there was nothing affectionate about it. It felt like possession. The next morning, I left for work early, stepping onto the driveway. My neighbor, an older man I'd always gotten along with, saw me. I lifted a hand in greeting. He looked at me. Then he turned away. That's when I noticed. Everyone had started treating me differently. Conversations were shorter, polite smiles were absent. The invitations, the holiday greetings, gone. And then the second message arrived. "If you want to know the truth, meet me." This time, I didn't delete it. I responded, and I showed up. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few customers who sat hunched over their coffee, lost in their own worlds. I had chosen a corner table, my back to the wall, my eyes on the entrance. I didn't know what to expect. The message had been vague, just a place and a time, and yet I came, not out of fear, not out of curiosity, but because deep down, something in me already knew the answer. Then she walked in. A woman in her mid-40s, dressed sharply, but with an air of exhaustion about her. She spotted me instantly, her expression unreadable, as if she was waiting for my reaction. She approached without hesitation and sat down across from me. "You're her husband," she said, more of a statement than a question. I nodded, wary. "And you are?" She exhaled, folding her hands on the table. "My name is Michelle. My husband, James, he's in a psychiatric hospital." I frowned. That name? I had heard it before. And then it hit me. He was the man who accused Elena of harassment, the one who was declared unstable and institutionalized. "I know what you've been told," Michelle continued, her voice steady but tight with emotion. "That my husband is a liar, a predator, that he tried to hurt her. But I need you to listen carefully. It's all a lie, and he's not the only one." I tensed. My mind instantly rejected the thought, but my gut clenched. Michelle reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive, setting it on the table between us. "This," she said, "is proof." I hesitated. My first instinct was to walk away, but I didn't. Instead, I took the flash drive and closed my fingers around it. That night, I plugged it into my laptop. There was one video. The footage was grainy, black, and white, like it had been taken from a security camera. A small office space, furnished with a desk, a couch, a single lamp casting dim light. And there she was, Elena. She stood in front of a man, James. He was sitting stiffly on the couch, his posture tense, uncomfortable. He tried to look away, but Elena stepped closer, blocking his path. She leaned in, speaking. There was no sound, but I didn't need to hear the words to understand. She was demanding something, pressuring him. James shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. She didn't back off. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. He tried to stand. She pushed him back down. My pulse pounded in my ears. Elena took out her phone, showing him something on the screen. I watched as his expression changed, from resistance to fear. His shoulders slumped, his hands unclenched. defeat. Then, the worst part. She moved onto his lap. I slammed my laptop shut. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't self-defense. This was control. This was coercion. This was who she really was. The next day, I met Michelle again. I didn't sit down right away. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to find the right words. "You were right," I finally said. "I saw it." She nodded, unsurprised. "There's more," she said. 8 more men willing to testify. Different places, different times, but the same story. I sank into the chair, rubbing my temples. I had spent years with this woman. How had I been so blind? Michelle's voice softened. "I know this isn't easy, but I need to know. Are you going to stand in the way?" I lifted my gaze to hers. "Do what you need to do," I said. "I won't stop you." That night, Elena knew something was wrong. She could sense it, the way a predator senses a shift in the air. She watched me closely over dinner. Her fork paused mid-air. "You're quiet," she said. I forced a shrug. "Just tired." She tilted her head, studying me. "No, it's something else." I set my glass down, meeting her gaze head-on. I said, "I'm tired, Elena." For the first time, she looked unsure. Days later, the lawsuit was filed. The moment it hit the news, Elena unraveled. She stormed into the house, pacing, her hands shaking. "You knew," she hissed. "You knew and you didn't tell me." I stayed seated watching her. "I didn't tell you?" I scoffed. "Maybe because you spent years lying to me." Her eyes flashed. She grabbed the edge of the table like she needed something to ground her. "You don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "They're lying. They're trying to destroy me." I leaned forward. I saw the video. Silence. For a long moment, she just stared. No shock, no denial, just calculation. Then, the switch. Her face softened. Tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "You're my husband. I love you. You know me. I did know her. I just hadn't known the truth." When she saw I wasn't buying it, her mask cracked, her voice turned venomous. "Do you think they'll believe you? Do you think you'll come out of this clean? You were with me for years. That makes you complicit. If I go down, you go down with me." For the first time, I was afraid of her. A few days later, they came for her. The knock on the door was sharp, precise. I opened it, already knowing what was coming. 2 officers stood there. "Elena Patterson." She was in the living room, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't scream, didn't fight. She just turned to look at me, and in that moment, I saw the real Elena. No regret, no fear, just pure, seething hate. And then they took her away. The first hearing was packed. She sat at the defendant's table, composed, her suit crisp, her expression unreadable. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was the victim, and when she finally looked at me across the courtroom, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, like she still had one last move left to play. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I sat near the front, my hands clasped together, my jaw tight as I watched the trial unfold. One by one, the victims spoke. Each man had a different story, different circumstances, but the pattern was always the same. Elena had chosen them carefully. Men in vulnerable positions, men who had something to lose. She had isolated them, manipulated them, forced them into situations where saying no wasn't an option. And when they resisted, she made sure they paid for it. A former employee, a business associate, a struggling journalist, a university professor, 8 men, 8 lives shattered. They described her threats in chilling detail, the way she would smile as she reminded them what was at stake, how she would dangle the possibility of ruining their careers, their families, their reputations. One of them, a man named Ethan Carter, a journalist, spoke with a quiet, measured voice. But his hands shook. "She told me," he said, his voice hoarse, "that if I didn't do what she wanted, I'd never work again. She had friends, influence. She said all it would take was a single phone call." That even if I fought back, people would only see a man preying on a woman. That in the end, the world would always believe her over me. He swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the witness stand. I believed her. I saw the jury shift uncomfortably. The weight of his words hung in the air. And then finally, James spoke, Michelle's husband, the man who had been locked away in a psychiatric hospital because of her. He had lost everything. His job, his home, his sanity, and yet he stood there in front of the court and spoke with no hatred, no anger, just quiet exhaustion. I kept telling myself I must have imagined it, he said, that I must have misunderstood, because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative meant that the woman everyone admired, the woman people saw as a leader, was a monster. He exhaled shakily, and I wasn't ready to believe that. I swallowed hard. Neither was I. She had sat motionless throughout most of the trial, her expression blank, her posture rigid. But something inside her fractured when James finished speaking. Her fingers curled into fists, her jaw clenched, and then, in the middle of the courtroom, she snapped, "You're all liars!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but Elena was past the point of caring. She twisted in her chair, her eyes burning as she locked onto me. "You!" she hissed. "You did this to me! You betrayed me!" I stared back at her, my chest tight. "You betrayed yourself, Elena." Her face twisted in rage. "You think they care about you?" She gestured wildly at the courtroom. "You think any of these people give a damn about you? You're nothing without me, nothing!" The guards moved in. She fought them, screaming, thrashing. "They're lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "They're all lying!" But no one believed her anymore. Not the jury, not the judge, not me. It didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies damning. But in the end, the question wasn't whether she was guilty. It was whether she was sane enough to stand trial. The psychologists reviewed her case. They examined her history. They listened to her outbursts, her rage, her complete inability to accept responsibility. And then, the final ruling came. Legally insane. She wouldn't go to prison. She would go somewhere worse. A psychiatric institution, the same place James had been sent. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When they read the verdict, she didn't react at first. She just sat there, her face eerily blank. But as the guards moved toward her, I saw something in her eyes. Realization, not regret, not sadness, pure, unfiltered hatred. And then she was gone. I didn't feel relief, not at first. In the days after her sentencing, I moved through life in a daze. People told me I had done the right thing, that I was lucky to escape her when I did, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt empty. Because the truth was, I hadn't just lost her. I had lost the version of her I once believed in. I spent weeks avoiding my own reflection. Because every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the man who had been blind for too long. The man who had ignored the warnings. The man who had defended her. The man who had loved a lie. One evening, I found myself standing by the window of my apartment, staring out at the city lights. I thought back to the first time I met her, the way she had looked at me that night after I had stepped in to help her. The way she had smiled, like she knew something I didn't. I had thought I was saving her, but maybe, from the very beginning, she had been the one hunting me. The person I was back then. The man who had followed her home for pie and tea. Who had believed in love, in fate, in happy endings. He didn't exist anymore. Elena had made sure of that. I closed my eyes, breathed in the cold night air, and for the first time in a long time, I let go.